My name is John Lydon. I'm the Chair of Religious Studies here at UNO, and I want to say on behalf of the Religious Studies Department, I want to welcome you all to this year's Goldstein Lecture on Human Rights. This is an event which has been hosted by the Religious Studies Department since 1999. Maybe some of you were here that year. Religious Studies is by nature an interdisciplinary field, incorporating insights and research from disciplines like philosophy, history, political science, sociology, anthropology, economics, and more. So we encourage an education of the whole person that includes understanding the multiple factors that shape our lives, our societies, and our values at the local, national, and international levels. And our sponsorship of this lecture has been a crucial part of that work. It was more than a quarter of a century ago then that the first Goldstein Lecture on Human Rights was given here at UNO. And these lectures have been made possible by the generous support of the Goldstein family, which established this fund at that time to honor the work of Shirley and Leonard Goldstein. During her lifetime, Shirley Goldstein was a tireless advocate for human rights around the world. In particular, she devoted many years to securing freedom for Jews persecuted by the Soviet Union. Often at considerable risk to herself, she traveled there, bringing support to the refuseniks who were not allowed to emigrate from Russia and returning here with information about their plight. She was actually the first person to bring audio tapes out of Moscow which described the persecution of Anatoly Sharansky, among others. For her work, she was awarded the Doctorate of Humane Letters by UNO, and she was also honored by the Jewish Federation of Omaha, as well as the National Conference of Christians and Jews. With the success of this lecture series over more than 2 decades, the Goldsteins have also expanded their support for education about human rights at UNO through the founding of the Goldstein Center for Human Rights and the Goldstein Family Community Chair in Human Rights, established through the support of Don, Gail, and Kathy Goldstein in honor of Shirley and Leonard. The Religious Studies Department has been a critical part of these initiatives, so we continue to co-sponsor a variety of events on human rights with the Goldstein Center throughout the year. We're very grateful for this partnership and for all the work the Goldstein family has made possible and continues to make possible in a world in which increasingly we need not only to be made aware of human rights abuses, but to learn how to do something about them, to make a difference in the world through education and advocacy, the very work that Shirley initiated during her lifetime and which the Goldstein family continues. So welcome. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Joanne Lee, the Chancellor of University of Nebraska, Omaha.
Thank you, John, and it's so wonderful to welcome all of you here. And I talked to some of our guests tonight, and they said, we're regular. We come every year. In fact, I attended school here in 61 and 62. I would say, Marty, welcome home. It's a little bit different than, when you were attending school, but there's one thing never changes. UNO is so pleased to host tonight's Goldstein Lecture for many, many reasons. I mean, look at the world right now, right? If conversation like this cannot happen, we lose hope. And I have to say, we're so honored because University of Nebraska at Omaha is your only public research university in the city of Omaha, serving over 1 million population for the state of Nebraska. And I always say that UNO has a core statement that people should not forget. Because we are the only public research university, we believe that our responsibility is really to serve people of the world. We are here to create public good. We are part of this community. We are not going to be shy away from having conversations that otherwise make people uncomfortable. The Goldstein Lecture is important because this is the responsibility of a university to have conversations that otherwise may not be able to happen in other places. We believe university provides that forum to have this uncomfortable conversation. Agree, disagree, we welcome you to speak of your mind. And I think John mentioned Shirley and Leonard Goldstein. They're obviously devoted to have this topic, human rights, to talk about it. Look around the geopolitics in the world. If it is not tonight, when are we going to make time to talk about human rights? So we're honored tonight to have the Goldstein lecture being here presented by the Community Engagement Center. Highlight Community Engagement Center. And I have to say, Don is a really good friend of mine. The first question I asked him, where's Andy? He's like, Andy's not feeling well, I'm gonna put a sticker here. Andy's not feeling well, and don't ask me. I wanna make sure that people know we are so grateful. On behalf of University of Nebraska at Omaha, thank you to the Goldstein family for supporting this lecture every year and continue that devotion to have tough discussion, but very thought-provoking conversation. So I think through our lectures, UNO faculty truly believe that we should have free conversation freedom in religious and enhance our UNO research in areas that otherwise may be challenging under the federal environment. But with that, I just want to say thank you for making time to spend with us tonight. I hope you enjoy tonight's lecture. I hope you will take away a lot of thought-provoking ideas. I hope you keep asking, what do we need to do together to contribute to our community? Thank you and have a great evening.
I'm also average height. It's hard to follow our chancellor, but here I go. Good evening. I'm Dr. Lana Obradovich, Associate Professor of Political Science and the Goldstein Family Community Chair in Human Rights. It's a great honor to introduce tonight's Goldstein Lecture speaker, Dr. Elazar Barkan. About 20 years ago, I'm not giving away my age, just as I began my PhD, I received an email that would unexpectedly shape the course of my work for some years to come. A professor at Columbia University was looking for someone who spoke Serbo-Croatian and was working on human rights to assist with a project on the former Yugoslavia. I answered and got that internship, and that professor was Dr. Elazar Barkan. We met once, just so that he could explain the project to me, which examined contested narratives and sought to model the possibility of dialogue across deep divides in the Balkans. This commitment to confronting difficult histories has defined Dr. Barkan's career. He's professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University, where he has directed both the human rights concentration at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs and the Institute for the Study of Human Rights. Professor Barkan is the author or editor of, I've counted 12, but please correct me if I'm wrong, including Memory Laws, The Politics of the Criminalization of Historical Narrative, Historical Dialogue and the Prevention of Mass Atrocities, and The Guilt of Nations, Restitution and Negotiating Historical Injustices, among many others. Across all of these projects runs a central concern: how societies confront gross historical criminal injustices, and how acknowledgement, historical dialogue, restitution, and negotiation can open paths toward reconciliation. A historian by training, Dr. Barkan holds a BA from Tel Aviv University and a PhD in comparative European history from Brandeis University. He will deliver his lecture, and afterward, we will have time for your questions in a Q&A session. So it is my great privilege to welcome Dr. Barkan as this evening's Goldstein Lecture speaker. So please join me in giving a very warm round of applause for Dr. Elazar Barkan.
Very nice. Well, I'm heartened by seeing so many of you physically here. So, welcome. Thank you for the invitation and for the warm welcome. And I hope that we can speak about this topic, which I will introduce on reparation. In the year 2000, I published the book, The Guilt of Nations, where I argued that during the decade since the end of the Cold War, there was an increase in global moral policies, where growing numbers of governments strove to amend and redress previous atrocities and war crimes, and to compensate victims and their descendants. This move took place primarily in Europe, applied differently towards indigenous peoples, and hardly at all in post-colonial situations. The particular unfolding of redress was shaped by the identity of the country in question. For example, Poland first compensated the church and smallholders who suffered under communism because of Polish Catholicism, while the Czech leaned towards property owners, more middle-class society. With the countries of Central East Europe negotiating their own identity through reparation programs. In the rest of the world, the discussion was more embryonic. There was widespread optimistic public discourse on reparations. Reparation, however, was not a new idea. It has been part of human history forever. Early in the biblical narrative, 4 Canaanite kings who were defeated by Abram in tribal warfare expected, according to the norm, to pay reparation, while the biblical narrator, emphasized that Abraham took only property that belonged to him and insisted that he did not take any loot. Reparation was a contentious issue. What exactly belonged to Abraham, and why was it so central to be introduced into the Jewish origin story? Extracting material benefits was the norm of warfare, but the Bible had to ground the war as justice, and hence to distance itself from injustices. Although the loser was expected to pay, it carried a whiff of more of controversy. Did the size of reparations enrich Abraham and enabled him to begin building a nation? Abraham denied that he engaged in retribution or reparation. Yet, the dispute was critical enough to the image of Abraham as to be rehearsed in detail in the Bible. In practice, the winner imposed reparation and engaged in looting, even if by another name. With victory came riches. This remained largely the convention in international relations for the next several millennia, until it shifted explicitly following World War II. Since then, reparation discourse has grown, adding complexity. Currently, the concept refers to several types of policies, and it is widely discussed, with more people actively taking part. In the UN lingo, reparation refers to several things, including restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantee of non-repetition. While reparations refer to several categories of redress, it is mostly presented as a self-evident concept. Although it includes subcategories and hence by definition a plurality, little discussion is directed conceptually at justifying conflicting rationales. Instead, the demands are treated as cumulative. It should be stated right at the start that the conceptual poverty of the culpable side is even greater. We don't have not the justification for the victims nor for the perpetrators. After all, democracies usually see themselves as moral institutions, and the rejection is not based on challenging the demands or ethical or property policy conversation. The present rejection to engage in a debate was part of the self-assurance of neoliberalism in the 1990s, demonstrated perhaps most poignantly by the title The End of History. Some of you may remember it. Promising a world without conflict ruled under neoliberal policies. Concurrently, during the 1980s, Latin America was emerging from the rule by dictators. Justice and redress became increasingly a concept associated with specific policies. Various countries slowly introduced the elements of transitional justice, and by the time South Africa was liberated from apartheid, redress seemed to have become a norm. Admittedly, that was more aspirational than real. The peaceful transition at the end of apartheid in South Africa, which delivered a global euphoria of ethical global order, fortified neoliberalism and lasted for almost a decade, overlooking the horror taking place at the same time in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. So the 90s are remembered as a wonderful period, although as Lana will testify, there were some things that needed to be taken care of. It presented a reality of a feeble international order headed by the UN. Belatedly, the public awoke to criticize the distressful reality, but could do nothing to prevent the violence, even in part. Addressing the reparation as a public policy presented its own dilemmas, since in many ways this was unprecedented and advocates had to rely on imperfect analogies. In addition to who should be redressed and in what order, the question was raised of what was adequate redress. To the question of how much should a reparation program cost, I pointed out in the late 90s, I'm embarrassed to say that it's almost 30 years now, that in practice, reparation agreements followed a vague calculation where it was deemed meaningful to the victims and hardly significant to the side of the offenders. This calculus, along a spectrum, remains the same today. But on the spoke of reparation, the guilt of nations was too optimistic, that means me, and underestimated the backlash against redress. Such was the case in Switzerland, for example, as the result of two international investigations of various Swiss institutions and of the state collaboration with Nazi Germany during the war. The federal Swiss government created a fund, and the question was who should be the beneficiaries. The self-image of Swiss as the virtuous nation increased the hope that some grand moral altruistic change would be implemented. In fact, I started my book by saying that on that date, human nature may have changed and people would privilege moral policies. The available funds enticed activists and victims to advocate for an initiative to match the creation of the Red Cross, which was established by Henry Dunant and a few prominent Swiss citizens who witnessed the horrific carnage of the Battle of Solferino. This was 1859. This led in time to the centrality of the Red Cross as a global humanitarian organization. However, in the years following 2000, the Swiss public sentiment shifted very quickly, and the funds were used to bolster populist nationalist goals rather than develop new international morality based on institutions. The Red Cross would not be emulated in the new millennium. The Swiss would not take the leadership in guiding international moral policies. If the 1990s were characterized by growing support for moral discourse, even if it remained more inspirational than concrete, then following 9/11, the war on terror focused on realpolitik and abandoned moral considerations, and by 2005, the global push for democracy was in decline. The question we face today is, where does redress stand today, and can we predict its role in the near future? Glancing at the news of the last few months, we may focus on how the question of redress for historical crimes appearing in new spaces. The Dutch king, for example, apologized for his country's part in colonialism, but there is loud opposition in Netherlands to pay reparations. The debate is primarily over cultural property, objects that looted from the colonies. The situation is similar in Belgium, which established a commission to respond to its colonial history, failed to account and apologize to horrific history. Portugal is engaged in constructing its own response, while King Charles in the UK is reputedly intensely engaged in formulating an apology to the descendants of slaves in the Caribbean. And Rishi Sunak, who was the Prime Minister in the UK between 2022 and 2024, if you remember, refused to apologize for Britain's slavery record. The current Labour government maintained the same policy, facing a growing demand to embrace reparations, in particular from Commonwealth countries, as reparations for colonial atrocities increasingly engage public discourse. The past occupies a growing space in national histories and the scope of human rights in shaping the immoral histories. At times, demands for accountability gains public support, leading to the contentious discourse that calls for amends. The willingness to engage with redress demands is mostly limited to minorities in the global north, while the global south increases demands but faces mostly lukewarm response with some measures of success. A closer study shows that despite the public discourse, the resistance to pay reparation remains. NIMBY, not in my backyard, is the leading formal response from governments. Nonetheless, there is a budding of reparation discourse within Africa and several post-colonial organizations. These demands, notwithstanding reservations concerning reparations, have grown over the last 40 years and are becoming a widely accepted language for discussing accountability for atrocities, crime against humanities, and even more general historical injustices. It has moved from a marginal phenomenon, mostly discussed locally in particular cases by activists, to a global comparative dialogue involving the identities of the groups in conflict. Those groups can be ethnicities, nationalities, minorities, religions. To evaluate where we stand today, we should explore the characteristics of several phases of reparation. 25 years ago, I focused on the German-Jewish Agreement for Reparation for the Holocaust, the Luxembourg Agreement, 1952, as unprecedented. its uniqueness being grounded in atonement. The novelty of the agreement stemming from having the perpetrator side agreeing to pay reparations without being compelled to do so. The criminal and genocidal side accepted material responsibility for the atrocities of the Holocaust and without being forced to do so by the Allies. The goal of the perpetrator side, as explained by Chancellor Adenauer, who was Chancellor of West Germany, was to declare that the German crimes broke all norms and that for the Germany to return to the civilized world, it had to atone for it, materially, ethically, and politically. It could do so only by reaching an agreement with the victims. The global, read American, Jewish leadership, including Israel. Reparations became a form of atonement, and in time was embraced as a form of fighting racism. It was not based on economic damages, but on the needs of victims and the capacities of the offenders, and it was generally not imposed. It materialized in the Marshall Plan, which conveyed the spirit, if not the vocabulary, of reparation, where the victors actually paid for the reconstructions of the defeated enemy. The exception was East Germany, which paid the Soviet Union and was not part of the agreement. The framework for reparation as atonement became, first slowly, but as a new ethical political norm which lay dormant for several decades, with a few embryonic instances by the 1980s, where perpetrators of major crimes have embraced their responsibility to compensate their victims and their descendants, and have expanded mostly since the end of the Cold War and the growth of the post-colonial world. A clarification in parentheses. The notion of responsibility for past crimes underscores continuity. We talk about Germans, as opposed to a break with the past, Nazi versus democracy. So we can see a continuity or a break, depends the language we are using. In the American South, which represents continuity versus depicting the new society, slave society versus democracy. Break with the new regime, deny responsibility and guilt. So the language already tells us what is our disposition. When we say unprecedented, we are referring to atonement, not to the retributive system. The German reparation to Jews conveyed atonement that must be voluntary in nature, even if only a small minority in Germany supported Adenauer at the time. Neither does it mean that atonement excluded retributive action. They were more symbolic, the retribution was more symbolic than imposing a hard divide between the old and the new regime. To clarify the uniqueness of atonement, we should compare it briefly to the reparations following World War I, which are among the best known examples of failed retributive reparations. For those of you who are not familiar, I don't want to leave you behind. After World War I, there was a massive imposition of compensation that Germany had to pay. So many have pointed to the reparations as the source of the economic disasters in Germany during the 1920s, which has led to the rise of Nazism. That is not to say that retributive reparation was the only or main cause of the rise of Nazism, as many have claimed. However, the punitive aspect and racism was exploited by right-wing in both Germany and France to incite reciprocal hatred. Consequently, it became a conundrum of how to address the economic damages of World War II without imposing an impossible burden on West Germany. It limited reparation to Germany's ability to pay, not to the approximate damages. That, however, left the Jewish victims abandoned. Here came the novelty of the agreement between West Germany and the Jewish Claims Conference, which represented the Jewish World Congress and Israel. Both countries had not existed when the crimes were committed a few years earlier. Both countries came into existence in 1948. How to respond to the Nazi represented by West Germany, Nazis' extermination of European Jewry, was very much on the mind of both the German negotiators with the Allies, which were parallel to these negotiations, as well as with the Jews in Israel. The Allies did not pressure Germany to come to an agreement with the Claims Conference because, in fact, their interests were in conflict. The more they would pay to the Jews, the less would be compensation for the Allies. Yet Adenauer insisted on reaching an agreement with the Claims Conference. The agreement became the anchor for West Germany and Israel relations in the following decades and expanded its scope from 1 billion to 100 billion over 7 decades. So that's another scope of how much reparations could be. In 1970, Germany went through it, in 1970s, Germany went through its own identity transformation closely tied to the young generation, embracing its responsibility to redress the Nazis' crime in Germany and amplifying its responsibility for the Holocaust. Because people have attached their identities to the narrative of the Holocaust and reparation, none could separate from it. The Germans' guilt motivated demands from Germany beyond Jewish claims. These included demands by surviving slave labor from Eastern Europe, oppressed by the Nazis, and even more recently from Poland and other European countries, and actually also from Africa. Other earlier cases of reparations given willingly were marked differently. These include payments to slave owners upon abolition of slavery for losing their property. I want us to comprehend exactly what I'm saying here. The victims of liberation were the property owners, were the slave owners, not the slaves themselves. So these include payments to slave owners upon abolition of slavery for losing their property, both in England as compensation to Caribbean slaves, as well as earlier by the French imposing payments on Haiti. Attempts to compensate freed slaves in the southern U.S. failed, and in many cases instead slave owners were compensated, and the previous enslaved lacking alternatives remained on the plantation doing the same oppressive work. The common denominator to these and other pre-World War II cases is that the reparations were paid because of imposition on the losers to pay the winners of the conflict. African Americans did not lose the war, but the character of the Union victory enabled even the Union to count the abolition of slavery as sufficient compensation. Hardly anybody in the U.S. perceived blacks to be equal. The South promoted local reparation to white landowners even before the end of Reconstruction. Nobody supported a renewed conflict to promote reparations for black, and the 40 acres and a mule category promised as a compensation by General Sherman to freed slaves remained a fantasy. The scope imagined by Sherman was of providing immediate relief, humanitarian in current lingo. Compensation is thought of paying the victims damages that would bring the freed slave to status quo ante, which was, after all, was slavery. So there was no return to the past. You had to imagine a future. The past was nothing to be desired, nor was reparation panacea. Instead, the current aspiration by some in the reparation movement in the US is to imagine a non-racist society that would redress all types of racism and compensate and abolish racism, not merely slavery, merely is in inverted commas. The imagination of the past as a non-racist utopia, or at least as a financial equivalent, by bringing the beneficiaries of reparation to par with the average American household, is a high bar. This understanding of the reparation would be unique as it does not echo any previous case. Its advocates present it as self-evident. The tension is between the demand for redress as humanitarian efforts to address poverty and presenting the untold scope of compensation to human rights violation as a self-evident demand. At this stage, the gap between the protagonist of reparation as full compensation and their antagonist doesn't seem to be bridgeable. Similarly, as demands for redress increases social and political polarization, new groups claiming to be the real victims, such as the talk by right-wing budding demands for reparation for a new group of victims, white men, who are victims of DEI. Yesterday's oppressors present themselves as the new victims of racism, rejecting the claims of the descendants of slaves. This is also evident in Europe, although currently this post-colonial debate is mostly on cultural property and what is referred to by the UN as satisfaction, which I mentioned earlier. Disagreements over who should be considered the victims have a long genealogy. England, for example, mentioned paid reparation to former slave owners in the Caribbean and did so to compensate them for their loss of property. The past presented a clear actuary, but certainly not genealogy of moral policy. Indeed, looking back at earlier reparation cases, we can only see today this compensation as aggravating the crimes, not as moral policy, although it was motivated by moral qualms. The Civil War and the liberation of slaves was a result of recognizing by the North of the inhumanity of slavery, and strictly speaking not enforced by external forces, although the Union rule was during Reconstruction or an occupation force. These cases are subject to current historical revisionist discourse. I would suggest that while there are exceptions, presently the state of reparation can identify 3 stages, and each includes numerous subcut cases. The first phase refers to reparation throughout history up to and prior to World War II. The older type of redress is characterized by being imposed by the victors in the conflict, and those who had to pay had no choice. This example of payment I mentioned already. This example of payment for the cost of the war was punitive and can be seen as mentioned already from antiquity, perhaps the most notorious case of the Guilt Clause, 1919. The second phase emerged from the debate in the US of how to deal with German reparation in World War II. One suggestion by Henry Morgenthau, for example, was to destroy the industrial bases of Germany to punish it for the aggression and cost of the war. This retributive proposal was rejected and in essence brought the end for the traditional reparation as punitive and imposed. This was replaced, as I mentioned, by the Marshall Plan, where aid was offered by the victors, the US, to rebuild Europe, provided aid to rebuild the economy of both defeated and aggressors as well as the Allies. This differed in the Soviet bloc. In the West, reparations were integrated into the economic policy and sustained the industrial and agricultural policies which enabled the growth of the economy. In the Soviet Union, the extracting of industrial goods as retribution limited economic growth. The other characteristic of the second phase was atonement, which we discussed already. There is much to say about it, but I want to only emphasize here again the uniqueness of the agreement, where the perpetrator side offered to redress their victims. The history of the agreement, its impact on the German people, on Israel, on Jews, on memory, and the role of history in national identity have all been explored extensively and are subject to further studies. At the time, the revolutionary impact of the agreement did not receive the political attention it would a generation later. The retributive side of the victors was symbolized in part by the Nuremberg trials. We know what the Nuremberg trials were. That largely ignored the Holocaust and focused on Nazi war crimes. Compare that to the extensive and growing place of the Holocaust received in the last 5 decades. The memory of the Holocaust was barely visible in the non-Jewish world discourse. It was no more than a footnote to the main event, which was the focus on the war itself, and then on the Cold War and the risk of nuclear war. For reasons that I will not go into generation at the moment, I'll just mention it. A generation later and still ongoing, the Holocaust became the focus of international discourse. Many countries shifted their discussion of their own losses in war to being Holocaust victims, while the war itself, battles and material warfare, receives much less attention, and with only slight exaggeration, I could say that it's been relegated to almost a context for the Holocaust. The Holocaust memory became a West European civil religion by 2000, while Central Eastern Europe struggled with incorporating into their own national identity, which ignored their own culpability in the Nazi execution of the Jews. This remains a political rift in the EU. The third wave of democracy and the struggle over international relations, beginning in 1970s, have shifted to include attention over the role of human rights and ethics, with the US carrying the flag of morality and setting rhetorical standards while committing violence globally. This evolved to demands for historical justice in different countries. The process of democratization, the embryonic push for what would become transitional justice, building on decolonization, manifested itself in an increasing number of groups which frame their own history as subject to the injustice and criminal, and themselves as victims, and began to demand justice. There were different types of activism, initially not involving demands to reparations, and very rarely referred to the Holocaust as a precedent. Many saw reparation as having a set sum and viewed the groups as competing among themselves over a finite sum of reparation. The most public demonstration of such competition was the attitude of some of the African Americans leaders towards the Holocaust. Louis Farrakhan would be a name that comes to mind. Increasingly, however, the recognition that past violence ought to be redressed became a valid topic which included minorities. Often connection to the Holocaust was made, seen as either as competitive or complementary relations. Activists first tended to frame their own history as history of victimization and almost always compared their suffering to that of the Jews. So it was not the Armenian and the Kurds or Armenian, and it was always comparing themselves to the Holocaust. The Holocaust got unique standing as the utmost manifestation. While this was happening in the background, reparation received a boost from the end of the Cold War and the development of redress in Europe. Concurrently, there was distinct discourse concerning restitution to indigenous peoples in the former English colonies, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US, including the payment of limited reparation in particular cases. These were domestic discussions, and while there was wide indirect reciprocal impact, the most immediate effect was determined by the politics in each country. In the meantime, outside Europe, in Latin America, and later in South Africa, the focus was on punitive redress and came under the category of transitional justice. Those retributive steps included trials and commission of inquiry over the crimes that were committed, side by side with atonement agreements. In the 1980s, Argentina and Chile were important examples, but overall the recognition was and is that even extensive punishment will be limited and inadequate relative to the scope of the crimes. While reparations are mentioned in transitional justice, the scope of the practice is marginal. Redress remained an inspirational statement, but largely unpaid commitment. This third phase emerged from post-colonial demands. These were first anchored in individual claims presented by intellectuals in Africa, the Caribbean, and the US. The demands included small groups which did not receive wide support. Most noteworthy, however, was the provisional and limited expansion in the last 2 decades of the anti-racism in the US, where Black Lives Matter shifted the public discourse to focus on the long history and continuity of racism and pushed DEI to the political center. This has been reversed with the election of Trump and his campaign against diversity in all its forms. With the full power of government policy actively repressing reparation demands, the future of reparation is uncertain, at least for the next several years. The latest demands for reparations come from previously colonized societies. One characteristic is the early demands was their ineffectiveness. Both in Africa and America, this remained the reality into the 21st century. This has begun to change as a result of several factors, including, but not limited to, the recognition of redress as critical for transitional justice reparation in the global north and mass resistance to state violence against African Americans in the US, as well as internationally. By 2000, there was a fairly notable and growing international demand for redress of major crimes globally. This presented ethical and apolitical legitimation for reparation internationally and domestically. Governments in Africa and in the Caribbean have elevated the topic from civil society to the international arena and to international law. 9/11, however, put pressure on policies motivated by morality. Redress discourse increased in public and the demands for reparations proliferated and have moved from the small civil society activism to a whole spectrum of international demands. The UN embraced the demands for reparation and provided new guidelines. Examples for public display varied. One example I want to point to of current activism is the 1619 journalistic project published in the New York Times in 2019. The date Juneteenth marks the end of slavery in Texas at the end of the Civil War. The date, which has been celebrated by African Americans for a century, led in 2021 as a response to police violence against African Americans to the federal government recognition of the date as the new national holiday, Juneteenth. Acknowledgement is considered as one form of reparation, as belonging to the category of satisfaction, as we mentioned, which the concrete federal recognition underscored the merit of reparation for racism. Some of the notable activism for the post-colonial reparation included in 1993 the first Pan-African Congress on Reparations took place in Abuja, Nigeria. Although it was a private initiative by Masoud Abiola, who brought together eminent Africans, not government representatives, which set a foundation for the 2001 United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Discrimination, and Xenophobia in Durban, South Africa. The Durban Conference publicized and elevated calls for redress for slavery, producing a declaration condemning slavery as crimes against humanity and calling on former European colonizing countries for an official recognition and apology. Led by Britain, European states that participated in the conference rejected the description of slave trade and slavery as crimes against humanity, arguing that these practices were legal under national and colonial laws at the time. The US refused to participate in the conference, partly in response to calls for, I quote, international compensatory scheme, unquote, for the slave trade and slavery. This was happening 2 or 3 days before 9/11, which followed immediately, and global attention shifted away. However, away from the public attention, international organizations such as the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent have since built on the agenda of the Durban Conference, which was also integrated into the UN International Decade for People of African Descent, Recognition, Justice, and Development that we started a year ago. In 2020, during the urgent UN debate in response to the protests surrounding George Floyd's killing in the US, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, stated that I quote, behind today's racial violence, systematic racism and discriminatory policies lies the failure to acknowledge and confront the legacy of slave trade and colonialism. She stressed the need to make amends for centuries of violence and discrimination, including through formal apologies, truth-telling, processes, and reparation in various forms. Again, the focus was on satisfaction. A more recent UN report in 23 acknowledges increased acceptance of the need to address the continuing impact of enslavement and colonialism, including through reparatory justice. I've written that in the fall, in the summer of 2025, when international disorder is shaken to its core, it is bound to shape the place of social justice and certainly of historical reparation. The goal here is to analyze the role of reparation and to emphasize local efforts of the cultural aspect of reparation. It is almost certain that with the political polarization, there will be no space in the national and international mega policies to include reparations of any kind. It may play a more central role in the discourse as it provides space and mechanism for political resistance and community building were faced by increasing authoritarianism. Thank you.
Thank you very much once again. We are going to open it up for questions. Just to set some ground rules, we want to make sure that questions are precise, brief, and that way we can cover as many as possible. And so please raise your hand. We've got one right here. Okay, there we go.
Did any of the Japanese Americans get reparations for being in the camps in America during World War II?
Yes, this was in the late 80s, and it's an exception, but it's also a small event, not international in scope, and was very much changed the Japanese-American existence in the country. Previously, they didn't feel affinity. They felt as strangers. And it's the young generation that pushed it on. And politically, because of the Senate rules, it was fast as pork. And it's an enormously good example for how reparation can change even small reparation, because they got $20,000 per person. That's all. And this is a great example for moral policies. Is that clear?
Go ahead.
Dr. Barkan, could you say a little bit more? When you came to my class today, you talked about local communities and kind of local conversations around ideas about reparation. And often when we think about reparation, we tend to think in these kind of broad terms, countries, regions, and so on. But you said some really interesting things about the way that communities might work together at the local level to have conversations about reparations that just maybe were a little bit more nuanced and went somewhere because it wasn't kind of such a broad discussion. Do you mind saying a little bit about where you might see conversations about reparations happening at the local level?
Right, thank you. So I didn't talk here about a project which I'm involved with, which is called African American Redress Network. And that is, if you look for it, you can see there is a map there of 500 places in the US where reparations are not discussed necessarily, but the idea of how to bring the suffering of the community, the uniqueness of the suffering in each community is addressed by activists. So I'll give the example that I gave in the morning. Evanston, which is a suburb of Chicago, has legislated reparation not for slavery, but for racist discrimination in the city, redlining, education, etc. And they fund this by taxing cannabis. So that's a new way of raising resources and paying reparation. Although there are not a large sums of money that are involved, it is clearly a good example for other municipalities. And that many cases, we talk about memory, and memory is being restructured or reconstructed through local efforts.
Thanks. Laura? Okay. Thanks for that really interesting presentation. In your analysis, you only talk about state actors. What happens, or how can we engage with reparations of non-state actors? And I'm thinking about transnational corporations, for example, Ford in Argentina, the shipping companies in Chile, ThyssenKrupp in Germany. What, besides going to the judicial arena, the private judicial area, how can states or civil society request reparations from non-state actors?
I can give a simple answer and a more complicated one. The simple answer is civic activism. You get organized and you put the demand and you make sure that it gets public attention. So that is not complicated. What's complicated is the achievement, the thought that you can achieve full reparation, full compensation. That cannot be the case. Every organization, or many organizations, whether in Germany, in Switzerland, in other places in the United States, tie themselves to or acknowledge their role in these atrocities. So that would be in the Nazis era, and that would be Krupp or Bosch, or will give programs, or in the United States, where a lot of organizations look at their complicity with slavery and want to make amends, at least to mark that as memory. So for instance, George Washington University was a Catholic Jesuit, and they sold their slaves. And that's a big project that they resuscitate who were the slaves. They trace their genealogy to them, and they are now getting free tuition and subsidies, those who were descendants of the slaves. So there are different ways of doing it. And most of it depends on activism, both on both sides. Because some, for instance, some would prefer to pay, if they are descendants of the oppressors, would like to pay reparation. They feel that they should, their life should not be contaminated by this. So the motivations differ, but it's a lot about activism.
Hi. I'm curious about your thoughts about helping young high school history and government students understand the importance and context of reparations.
The question is, what should be the curriculum?
Just not only the curriculum, but how can we help them understand and digest that idea?
That's a good question, which I don't have a ready answer, but I will contemplate. I will suggest perhaps two things which work with education. First of all, explain the importance of it, and secondly, make it relevant to their life. So whatever you do, you can simplify the narrative, but then make them do projects that will see who did they recognize, what crimes they recognize that need reparation, what in their life need reparation, justified reparation. So I think this combination of two things, because one thing that I maybe not explicated enough, reparation is about establishing relationships. It's not about a final envelope that you give so many dollars and everything is done. It begins, as I said, $1 billion, and I don't know which currency we use, but about $1.5 billion was the first agreement between West Germany and the Jews, and over 50 years it grew up to $1 billion, to $100 billion. And that is because the countries expanded the relationship, they felt responsible, they knew what they were responsible for, and they gave humanitarian, so old people should not die from poverty, but this was their idea, and they were working in relationship. And the same thing would happen in the US, I believe. But it's a good question.
I'm wondering about a lot of the cases you talked about where someone was willing to do something and engage in some kind of reparations. There was some kind of conception of someone who would benefit from this, even if it was done in a punitive way. But or in these more humanitarian cases, someone is perceived this group needs help. I'm thinking about cases where that hasn't happened and how you might think about those. You talked about the Armenian genocide, which of course is one that Turkey's never recognized and has not been addressed enough, perhaps. And I was also wondering about Cambodia, where the genocide that happened there was, it doesn't seem like it was ever fully reckoned with, and maybe because there was no one who would clearly benefit from addressing it, so it has simply been ignored, if you think that's accurate. If you could comment a bit on that, how to address a situation where no one is really motivated to do something about it because no one is clearly perceiving where the benefit is and addressing it.
So first of all, let us disabuse ourselves from the first notion that most cases are addressed. Most cases of atrocities, war crimes, are never addressed. And the only place, there are very few cases which people agree to address. In this way, Cambodia didn't involve in anything, and the Khmer Rouge didn't engage with it for decades after they were defeated. So reparation is really down the line there. I don't think that it wasn't because people didn't need it, but there was some recognition of the suffering by showing the jails, by showing the atrocities. But Cambodia, unfortunately, doesn't embark on human rights as a policy. Is this answer or not really? Okay.
If you don't mind, Dr. Barkan, we actually had kind of a similar question here on Zoom asking about reparations from actors that refuse to acknowledge what happened. They also mentioned the Armenian genocide, and that it says, for example, the Ottoman carried out the extermination of Armenians during World War I. While they no longer exist, their successor state, Turkey, refuses to even acknowledge that it took place. So there's some kind of similar questions about sort of what you do when there's either not an acknowledgement or not a will to address human rights violations. But sort of is there anything to do in cases where there's, let's say, disagreement about sort of what actually happened and whether we, how we recognize human rights violations?
The Armenians is a very interesting case where activism, the destruction of Armenian communities in 1915, and actually some say that it goes back to 1860, the achievement is great because the genocide has become the core identity of what to be Armenian means today. And recognizing and lobbying, and there is a large community of Armenian diasporic, two largest communities. One is in Los Angeles and the other is in France. And in both cases, the politics of recognizing is really at the forefront. And Turkey is losing the battle for not recognizing the genocide. Everybody almost in the world, just like the Palestinian state, the recognition of this week actually, is not material, but it is political. Similar case has been with the Armenians for decades. And I think that the non-recognition actually made it more important to Armenians, and their identity is really anchored in the memory of the genocide. So there is reparation, and recognition doesn't have to be a lovey-dovey relationship. It could be political struggle, and that was the case. That's the case with the Armenians.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. I have a question about the role of the apology in the acknowledgement element that you were describing earlier, and I was just reminded of something I read this morning about how the Danish Prime Minister just on Wednesday issued a public apology for the government's role in medical malpractice against Greenland's Inuit women and female children in the late 1960s and early 1990s. And the story was just about how after years of the public pressuring the Danish government to say an apology publicly, this has finally been done earlier this week. So I was wondering if you could talk about the role of the apology in an acknowledgement, how it was done historically, and what you think sort of the optimal form of acknowledgement is. Should it include some sort of apology? What language should that include?
This was the topic I wrote about just before I go to reparation. So it's dear to my heart. I think apologies is a trend that began in about 1980 with moral policies. There are examples previously, but this was once an apology was pronounced, there were demands of others to apologize as well. And the fight over apologies was, the dispute over apologies was, if I apologize, then you'll bring a lawsuit against me, and then I'll need to pay. So I won't pay reparation. I don't want to pay reparation, therefore I won't apologize. And this tension existed. There are different ways in which apologies are given, and the more apologies are public in the public domain, the more comprehensive they become in order to make a difference. So we talked about Adenauer earlier today. So when Adenauer brought to the Bundestag the demand to legislate the reparation, he said, for crimes committed in the name of the German people. Now, focus on this formulation for a second. In the name of the German people means not by the Germans. It's the discontinuity. And this would not be considered reparation, apology nowadays. The most flippant apology formulation that I can think of is, I'm sorry you made me do it. And this is the kind of apologies that people can take on themselves or can dissuade or can distance from themselves. But today, there is a recognition that apology has an autonomous space, and it's an important component of satisfaction, and acknowledgement has to come from the perpetrators. It's not good enough for Armenians that the French parliament votes in favor of apology or in favor of recognition because it's not done by the perpetrator. And the perpetrators have to be the ones who make the apology. This is very broad. By the way, the mutilation of the native indigenous women was done similarly in the United States and in various colonies in the beginning of the century, 20th century.
Hi, I had a question. Are there any examples of where efforts at reparation were backfired, maybe in an effort to gain political, like to advance one's political image or agenda, or try to get people on their side, but maybe came off as their reparation was meaningless? Or I was wondering if you had any examples of that, and maybe that's role in our current political context.
Backlash is a strong word. Since reparation always, if they happen, it's not always that they happen, but if they happen, is a conversation and an agreement between two sides. So the agreement doesn't entice or incite backlash. But you're right that sometimes demands for reparation can have a backlash. And I can think of one example with African Americans is the larger the demands, the more opposition they encounter. So it's not an agreement of reparation, it's demand of reparation that maybe create public opinion. Instead of enticing it, it's rejecting it. And that's a tough question because we don't know how politics will change given the fact that we can't predict.
Thank you so much for this really interesting and important talk. I was wondering if there's anything, thinking about the different kinds of stages of reparations that you described, is there anything sort of meaningfully or substantively different when we're thinking about intra versus interstate, or like domestic versus interstate or international kinds of reparations?
An important question. I think we have too few examples to classify it. but it is critical. For example, democratization is an important component that includes apologies, includes trials, and maybe includes reparation. This was the case in Argentina, but for instance, in South Africa, the commission and the hearing captivated the country and captivated the world for 2 years almost. And there was a component of reparation there, but it never really manifested itself. We never implemented. This was domestic. Interstate. Germany is probably the most important one to pay reparation interstate. I'm trying to remember, you'll excuse me that I don't bring another example. But for instance, I can bring a non-example, which would be Japanese for the slave women, sexual slave women. This was not a question of money, because there were very few survivors, and if they paid $20,000 for each of the sex slaves, who were old women and poor, it would have cost them like a flight from Tokyo to New York for just the activists. So it was not a question of funding, but they refused to admit that the state was responsible for it. And that galvanized Korea and nationalism in Korea like nothing else. And they brought all their anti-colonialism against Japan to the fore. So this is an example of where it wasn't strictly backlash, but maybe it's also a good example of backlash. There are demonstrations in Seoul every week, every day even, for many years, and it's a galvanizing force, just like we spoke about the Armenians.
Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions, do we? I would ask you all once again to give a warm round of applause to Dr. Barkan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. Please keep on following the Goldstein Center for Human Rights for all of our events that are coming up this year, this semester in particular. Thank you once again, and have a great evening.